a glorious beginning for your lives. The field of honor calls you. Personal ambition must be thrown aside in the one great sacrifice for our country.
I cannot think of many film-related subjects that come with as much complexity as that of the cinematic depiction of war. Between the contradictory statements of famous directors, like Truffaut saying that every film about war ends up being pro-war, and Spielberg claiming that every war film, good or bad, is anti-war, there appears to be a lot of ambiguity about what it is that war films actually communicate. Definitions of what it really means to make an anti-war film therefore also remain vague and inconclusive. In an article from the BBC, California State University professor of philosophy Dennis Roddermall said that anti-war films must at least portray a nuanced view of deadly combat, one that depicts the infliction of lethal violence as a norm of behavior, and as a force striking down randomly. In the same article, New York University film professor Cheryl Antonio said that they have to show both sides. They have to ask if war is just a national tragedy for the victor, or if it is terrible for everybody.
If we threw away these rifles and these uniforms, you could be my brother.
There are plenty of war films that meet these criteria, but for many of them they are not enough to definitively label them as anti-war. In fact, many of them are heavily debated for having the exact opposite effect, like American Sniper, or even some classics like Saving Private Ryan or Full Metal Jacket.
Good night, ladies.
One complicating factor is that making a film with certain intentions doesn't mean it will be perceived accordingly. Apocalypse Now, for example, is a slow-burning journey into a heart of darkness that comments on the dehumanizing effects of war, but also contains some isolated scenes, most notably the Ride of the Valkyries, that communicate the excitement of warfare so effectively that the larger context it is placed in is easily forgotten. While such misinterpretation is bound to happen, as filmmakers can never fully control the reactions to their work, nor can they account for every specific worldview that is projected onto it, they can definitely muddle their own message by not thoroughly considering the effect their images really have. Just look at, as the channel Every Frame a Painting pointed out, how Michael Bay filmed the devastating attack on Pearl Harbor with the same cinematic spectacle that is also seen in fictional blockbuster adventures, and that he himself would later use to create exciting action scenes in the Transformer films, and to tell another real-life war story in 13 hours. To illustrate, contrast this shot from Pearl Harbor with a similar moment in the film Midway, in which the point of view remains with the Americans under attack, and not the spectacle. Well, mostly. A better example is Dunkirk, in which the point of view is so restricted that the danger becomes a constantly ominous presence, and the spectacle terrifying. The Russian film Come and See takes this even further by presenting a fully subjective experience from the point of view of a young boy. This implies, among other things, that we not only hear the sounds he hears in the world around him, but also the sounds that are haunting his mind, thereby connecting us even closer to the traumatic effects war has on the human psyche. However, despite the amount of care and consideration that is given to the depiction of warfare, another complicating factor is that the audience is, and will always be, observing it from a safe and comfortable distance. And so, however realistic the feeling, however profound our catharsis at the end, the experience is always a simulated one. It is never the same as going through the real thing. Though this is a question that can be brought up in the general context of our consumption of stories. When it comes to something as impactful as war, it is fair to question how and to what extent this matters. These are but a few of many issues that illustrate our complex relation to war films, and by extension, to war itself. So what does all this mean for the anti-war film? Well, that's what we're here to find out. The goal of this discussion, however, is not to end up with another dichotomy to label films as either pro or anti-war, but to construct a deeper understanding of a complicated subject that does not let itself be captured in such simplified terms. So today, let's deconstruct humanity at its most destructive. Examine what the narrative, cinematic, and contextual elements of war films communicate to us, how they reflect and shape our perception of war, and explore the purpose and meaning of witnessing the darkness of warfare through cinema. For in the words of novelist Thomas Hardy, if a way to the better there be, it exacts a full look at the worst. Before we get into our more specific discussion of war films, we first have to have some understanding of war itself. We have to understand why, over the course of human history, we seem so eager to engage in deadly conflict with each other. Why the soldiers that are sent into these battles, despite knowing the horrors they will face, seem so willing to put themselves in harm's way. And why heroic causes so easily result in atrocities.
This great evil, where's it come from? What seed, what root did it grow from?
In his book Escape from Evil, Ernest Becker makes an attempt to uncover the roots of human evil and our appetite for war and destruction. He does so by building on the thesis he laid out in his Pulitzer Prize-winning book The Denial of Death, which argues that our primary driving force is the desire to escape death. Like all other animals, human beings have an innate fear of dying, but unlike animals, we are constantly aware of this inevitable fate, and because we know we cannot escape it literally, we attempt to do so symbolically.
You ask yourself what the sum total of your life represents, what difference your being there at any time made to anything, or if it made any difference at all, really.
The classic and most obvious example of how we try to do this is through religion, which promises some kind of continuation of life after our physical death, be it via heaven, hell, or reincarnation. But Becker argues that it is actually the entirety of human culture that functions this way, as culture provides us with the opportunity to fit ourselves into a greater whole that gives our lives meaning, into some larger social construct that endures after we're gone, like a nation or an ideology.
I'm very proud to serve my country, yeah.
More specifically, cultures provide us with meaningful actions and virtues, which, through their realization, allow us to symbolically transcend death, to expand our lives beyond our physical existence. In simple terms, cultures provide heroism. Historically, heroes have always had an important role and function. As Becker writes, he is the one who gambles with his very life and successfully defies death, and men follow him and eventually worship his memory because he embodies the triumph over what they fear most, extinction and death.
You wanna live? Get off the beach!
And nowhere is this more obvious than in war. Among the chaos, death, and destruction of warfare, the hero stands out as a life-affirming force, and their presence alone encourages people that they too can be victorious over death, even though death is staring them right in the face.
Let's go! Keep it moving!
A good example of this can be found in an episode of Band of Brothers in which the Allied forces attacked the town of Foy. As they are charging the snowy fields, one of the captains suffers a mental breakdown which causes the entire mission to stumble. The captain is then relieved by a more heroic one.
Alright, I want mortars and grenade launchers on that building till it's gone. When it's gone, I want first to go straight in. Forget going around. Everybody else follow me.
Yes, sir.
One whose decisiveness and courage immediately embolden everyone around him. To top it off, he pulls off a truly death-defying stunt by running right through enemy lines to connect with the rest of his men stuck on the other side, all of which to the great admiration of his followers. By understanding cultural systems as hero systems, we can begin to understand why people are so willing to sacrifice themselves for their country or their beliefs. For in such a social structure, the sacrifice of one's physical being is but a small price to achieve symbolic immortality, to become a hero for eternity. But as the renowned psychoanalyst Otto Rank pointed out, there is something paradoxical about hero systems emerging in reaction to our desire to escape death, as it primarily seemed to have resulted in us becoming more concerned with achieving immortality, rather than actually preserving our lives.
I was just protecting my guys. They were trying to kill our soldiers, and I'm willing to meet my creator and answer for every shot that I took.
I think one of the reasons why no one can seem to agree on whether or not the film American Sniper is pro or anti-war is because it captures this exact paradox. Because while the film does portray its main character in all his human fallibilities, and as someone who exists in a self-destructive hero system, at the same time it also indulges rather uncritically in his legendary hero status within that system.
You're that guy, the one they're calling the legend. You got like 24 confirmed kills.
Wow.
And delivers on the promise of symbolic immortality by the end. A film that more purposefully captures this paradox is The Bridge on the River Kwai. The story begins with British prisoners of war who are forced to build a bridge for their Japanese captors. In the face of such great adversity, the British officer pushes his men to find dignity and purpose in their work, a work that will transcend their harsh conditions, and the war as a whole.
One day the war will be over. I hope that the people who use this bridge in years to come will remember how it was built and who built it.
And while this may have begun as a means of coping with their situation, gradually it becomes clear that for the officer, the building of the bridge becomes a microcosm of an immortality project, of a source for a heroic victory over death. He becomes so attached to his heroic goal that when a group of soldiers sneak into the camp to blow up the bridge, he has become too deluded to recognize them as his allies, and attacks them instead.
Blow up the bridge! Look out, there's no... No! No! Help!
The result is a tragedy for pretty much everyone involved, including the officer himself, who collapses onto the detonator and destroys the whole bridge anyways. Leaving us with the only sensible conclusion.
Madness. Madness.
Hero systems, however, are not just paradoxical. They are also, as we shall soon see, an important, if not the most important, driving force for human evil. And if we are to truly understand the potential for and meaning of anti-war films, we need to travel a bit further into this heart of darkness. The reason that Becker is so intent on understanding cultural systems as hero systems, and subsequently questioning them in a highly critical manner, is because he argues they are intrinsically connected to human evil. To him, the great paradox of human existence is that our consciousness seemingly transcends our animal nature in an almost godlike fashion, while our body does not. Or, as he so eloquently puts it, man has an awareness of his own splendid uniqueness in that he sticks out of nature with a towering majesty, and yet he goes back into the ground a few feet in order to blindly and dumbly rot and disappear forever. And so, assuming that our main driving force is our desire to transcend death, and that hero systems are the primary vehicle for that transcendence, heroism also functions as a denial of our physical limitations and animal nature, which Becker described as the negative which is incompatible with the absolute values we're striving towards.
Enough out of it, soldier! Sergeant, I want you to arrange for the immediate transfer of this baby out of my regiment. I won't have other brave men contaminated by him.
In Jungian terms, it can be described as our shadow, as that part of ourselves that we fear, that we feel ashamed of, that we refuse to acknowledge.
You won't have cowards in my army.
We already saw the presence of this denial in the functioning of heroism that inspires soldiers to boldly charge into deadly situations, and briefly makes them forget or ignore their own vulnerability.
Look, all these guys, they know your name. They feel invincible with you up there. They're not. They are if they think they are.
But repression itself is not enough to fully deny our shadow, for what is repressed is still internal. It can still find its way back to the surface. And so what we see in hero systems, and this is where we get to the nature of evil, is that the shadow is projected outwards. As psychologist and psychoanalyst Eric Neumann explains, the shadow, which is in conflict with the acknowledged values, cannot be accepted as a negative part of one's own psyche and is therefore projected. That is, it is transferred to the outside world and experienced as an outside object. It is combated, punished, and exterminated as the alien out there, instead of being dealt with as one's own inner problem. To put it simply, hero systems lead to scapegoating.
This is what happens when a world dies. Foreigners swarm over our streets. Immigrants who don't care for the past, only for what they can grab.
Scapegoating has always been an effective tool to organize people under hero systems, again be they nations, religions, or ideologies, for the simple reason that it absolves individuals of their deepest struggles and unites them in the face of an external evil. An evil that not uncoincidentally represents precisely that which they seek to overcome. An evil that is now clear, tangible, and destroyable. One of the most infamous examples of this is Nazi Germany, on which Becker writes, Hitler's rise to power was based on his understanding of what people wanted and needed most of all, and so he promised them, above everything else, heroic victory over evil.
Only when you understand that, can you understand what Hitler meant to us. Because he said to us, lift your heads. Be proud to be German. There are devils among us. Communists, liberals, Jews, gypsies. Once these devils will be destroyed, your misery will be destroyed. It was the old, old story of the sacrificial lamb.
It is because of investigations into the nature of Nazi Germany, such as depicted here in Judgment at Nuremberg, that Hannah Arendt also spoke of the banality of evil, a term she coined in response to the post-war trial of Adolf Eichmann, a Nazi officer who, despite having committed horrible crimes against humanity, showed no evil intent and appeared, in her words, neither perverted nor sadistic, but terrifyingly normal, a man who was mostly concerned with advancing his career and following orders. The banality of evil then was coined to point out this thoughtlessness with which evil acts can be committed. In Becker's terminology, we could say a man like Eichmann was so indoctrinated by his hero system that he was oblivious to how it was driving him towards evil. Though Becker also argued that the banality of evil is not so passionless as Arendt claimed, as it is born out of our deeper desire to transcend death. Eichmann wanted to be liked by his superiors, but for Becker, this did not merely make him a mindless follower, but rather someone driven to be part of the heroic group within his hero system. The real significance of Arendt's report, and of Becker's concept of hero systems, is that the emergence of evil is not tied to any specific people or to some malicious, villainous attitude, but to greater social structures that envelop us and blind us to their implications. And we all exist in such structures, structures that promise heroic victory to those on the inside, and makes evil into something external. After the Second World War, for example, there were many who believed that by achieving victory over the Nazis, we also achieved victory over the evil they represented, which unfortunately isn't the case. But it goes to show that there is a fine line between recognizing a real threat to oneself or a community, and using that threat to delude ourselves into believing that we can erase the shadow of our own light by violently putting out someone else's.
I just want to believe in what we're doing here.
Well, there's evil here. We've seen it.
Yeah, there's evil everywhere.
It's a delusion that often reveals itself through promises like, if only these threats are eliminated, our freedoms will be protected. If only these enemies are destroyed, we will bring honor and justice to our nation. If only we end this war, we will end them all. Knowing all this, it is finally time to take a more critical look at war films and zoom in on some particular aspects of hero systems and their specific representations in cinema. Hopefully we will then get a better grip on what anti-war films can be and what they should aspire to. Even though what we've discussed so far is but a mere introduction to the work of Ernest Becker, and even less so to that of Hannah Arendt, I think it is enough to get a sense of the deeper dynamics of war and human evil that echo into the films we see about it. It also gives us a better context for the anti-war criteria listed in the introduction, and we can now point out how they can indeed be effective, but also how they have their limitations. The first criteria for an anti-war film was that they must show a realistic depiction of deadly combat. They must provide an honest reflection of the acts of violence committed during war. With the essence of hero systems being that war is necessary to overcome evil, and that suffering and death are rewarded with honor, what is probably the greatest merit of realistic violence is that it emphasizes how few soldiers actually die a meaningful heroic death. It reminds you that there's a good chance you won't go out in a blaze of glory, but are more likely to die in some silly way before you've even gotten a chance to display any real heroism. Maybe you are hit the moment you step on the battlefield, maybe even before that.
Shit!
Maybe you're hit by friendly fire, or maybe you accidentally blow your own butt off by not carefully handling a grenade.
I blew my butt up! I blew my butt up!
A realistic depiction of violence also serves to show that even if you do survive a war, you probably won't feel like a hero. In fact, the impact of combat can be so traumatic that the toll it takes on your mental health can end up destroying exactly what you thought you'd protect, and leave you as a mere shell of your former self that's neither heroic, nor victorious over evil, nor death transcending.
War don't ennoble men, turns them into dogs.
What is important to remember is that in hero systems, violence and suffering can be redeemed as long as they serve a greater purpose. As Becker wrote, what man really fears is not so much extinction, but extinction with insignificance. And so when we're discussing the cinematic depiction of combat and trauma, this nuance is precisely the reason why many war films stumble in their message. One popular film that exemplifies this is Saving Private Ryan. The film opens with the invasion of Allied soldiers at Normandy. The 20-minute or so sequence, which is filmed in a realistic-looking documentary style, features graphic violence, terrified soldiers, and the overall chaos and destruction of combat. But after that, as Anishka Monet explains in her essay Is There Such a Thing as an Anti-War Film?, the conventions of Hollywood storytelling re-emerge and ultimately frame the violence and the cost of human life as heroic. and renders it all meaningful. This is most notably demonstrated as our main hero falls at the end, which could have left us wondering if the sacrifice to save Private Ryan was worth it or not. But instead, the film provides us with a clear answer with its epilogue in which Ryan lives to be a good man and beloved grandfather, who remembers and honors the men who died for his sake. In doing so, we are reassured that all is well, that all these sacrifices eventually served a heroic purpose, and death has successfully been transcended to achieve greater significance.
Someday we might look back on this and decide that saving Private Ryan was the one decent thing we were able to pull out of this whole god-awful shitty mess.
To emphasize, this doesn't make Saving Private Ryan a bad film, but it does make it a comfortable one, and as such it greatly detracts from its effectiveness as a true anti-war statement. In his review, David Walsh also draws attention to the film's heroic leaders. The implicit stance taken by the film, he writes, is that only the authorities in Washington concerned themselves with ideological matters, while the men in the field were unthinkingly doing the dirty work. By looking closer at the representatives of what we could see as the film's hero system, we indeed see they are portrayed as righteous, rational, and deeply concerned with the suffering of soldiers and their loved ones. The point is not so much if leaders were actually like this or not, but that it doesn't at all question the hero system that is driving the violence. The film states the sacrifices were costly, but then assures us they were laid upon the altar of freedom. And this sentiment of meaningful suffering echoes throughout the entire film, and in doing so, redeems it. What it comes down to is that despite showing the gritty reality of combat, war films can still romanticize instead of criticize if they do not question the general function of their hero systems. And so, in our effort to explore the potential for true anti-war statements, let's examine if this can be done better. The second important criteria for anti-war films was that they have to show both sides of the conflict, which Clint Eastwood took pretty literally by making two films on the Battle of Iwo Jima, one from the perspective of the Americans and one from the perspective of the Japanese. But I don't think it has to be as literal as this.
History is full of wars, fought for 100 reasons. But this war, our war, well, I want to believe, I have to believe, that it's all worthwhile because our cause is just.
Becker wrote that all wars are holy wars, in the sense that they serve as revelations of fate, as a testing of divine favor, and as a means to purge evil from the world at the same time. A hero system reinforces the belief that only its own followers are meant for heroic destiny, and scapegoats others to fuel its holy crusade towards that destiny. And so the value of showing both sides is that it helps to counteract scapegoating, to expose how those who are accused of embodying absolute evil are actually innocent, or misguided by their own hero system. Either way, it grants humanity to those who would otherwise be dehumanized.
Are you loved by all? Know that I was too.
But this isn't always as easy as it may seem. It generally works well for conflicts that, assuming a Western/American perspective, are far removed from our own experiences, or for wars that are now generally condemned as having been terrible for everybody involved. But for conflicts that do hit closer to home, showing the other side often remains limited to only showing parts of the other side. Many films on the war against terror, for example, will often show American soldiers connecting to foreign families. In particular, they show them connecting with children, the almost universal symbols of innocence. The issue is that while this does help to counteract the mistaken belief that there are entirely savage nations or people, It doesn't give us much insight into the actual group that these soldiers are in conflict with, and therefore into the conflict as a whole. And when that group then ends up victimizing this now humanized other side, as often happens in these films, it only reinforces their assumed evilness and the righteousness of the war against them. Especially when it comes to harming children, this message can easily be twisted into one where, as Monette writes in her essay, the enemy is so perverse and cruel that they will harm even defenseless children, whereas our side protects them and tries to keep them safe. One important reason why I think it is so difficult to really portray and question another hero system is because it always reflects back on our own. If we are shown how others were driven to war and violence because of false beliefs, it suggests the possibility that we are too. Note that this doesn't mean that every hero system is equal, and that all acts of violence caused by it are the same, but it does mean that we are all susceptible to promises of heroic victory in the same way, and this can be an uncomfortable thought.
The tribunal is now in session. God bless the United States and this honorable tribunal.
A good way to illustrate this is by looking at the aftermath of the Second World War. In her report on the trial of Adolf Eichmann, Hannah Arendt also brought attention to the issue of punishment, which the film Judgment at Nuremberg also brings up.
Well, let's face it. Hitler is gone, Goebbels is gone, Goering is gone, committed suicide before they could hang him. Now we're down to the business of judging the doctors, businessmen, and judges. Some people think they shouldn't be judged at all.
The film extensively explores how the Nazi regime came into power and how it led to the terrible crimes against humanity, but it also zooms in on the experiences of ordinary citizens.
You're good people. I believe that. Then, what was it like for you living under Hitler?
And there is a genuine attempt to understand what happened from their perspective. We can immediately see how it raises important questions. What heroic victory was promised them? How did it all turn so violent? How did all the good people go along with it? And perhaps most importantly, who is really responsible? The reason questions like these can be rather uncomfortable is because they invoke another question. If it happened to them, could it happen to us? And more specifically, could this happen to me? Am I too susceptible to this great evil?
Für alle, denen noch nicht klar ist, warum sie hier sind. Sie sind hierher nach Dänemark gebracht worden, hier nach dem Krieg etwas aufzuräumen.
The film Land of Mine also presents an insightful reflection on these issues. Set in Denmark just after the Second World War, the story follows German prisoners of war who were forced to clear beaches from landmines. A highly dangerous job that, not unsurprisingly, claimed many of their lives and was later deemed one of Denmark's worst war crimes. As the Danish officer begins to question what justice is really achieved by putting these young and largely inexperienced boys through this kind of punishment, we are shown how easy it is to overextend our holy wars against evil. How easy it is to misdirect anger and desire for justice onto those who do not deserve it. And how easy it is to choose personal gratification over asking the all-important question. Who is really responsible for the violence and destruction of hero systems?
It was impossible. The only proof of that would be their dead bodies lying in the bottom of the trenches. They're scum, Colonel. The whole rotten regiment.
In Stanley Kubrick's Paths of Glory, a battalion of soldiers fails to execute an impossible order that would have gotten them all killed, after which the officers arbitrarily pick 3 of them to put on trial for cowardice. Our main hero does his best to defend them, but it becomes clear that the whole show is rigged from the start, and the men end up being executed as we watch, knowing full well their deaths serve no meaningful purpose besides pointless bureaucracy and the grandiosity of uncaring leaders.
This sort of thing is always rather grim. But this one had a kind of splendor to it, don't you think?
The important lesson here is that hero systems do not have equal power structures. More often than not, there is a hierarchy that is purposefully kept in place by those at the top who personally benefit from it. On the surface, this may be because of greed, grandiosity, or a hunger for power, but beneath all that it is probably because of the simple reason, as Becker points out, that it fulfills their own immortality fantasy.
Of course, it would be absolutely vital that our top government and military men be included.
Kubrick also effectively demonstrates this in his film Dr. Strangelove, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb. Here we not only see how the incompetency of the established forces of the Cold War lead to an all-destructive nuclear apocalypse, but also how, being promised a safe shelter and plentiful women, their only concern is themselves.
Actually, they would breed prodigiously, eh? There would be much time and little to do.
In a way, it shows how leaders and other prominent figures of hero systems are often the ones who are most deluded by them.
I mean, you're young. You're just out of the academy. You got your war. This is 15 years. This is my first war.
As such, they are also likely to be the most disconnected from any real sense of humanity, and therefore most willing to sacrifice it for their own heroic victory over death.
If some of the men pass out, why hell, they'll just have to pass out.
But because hero systems have fundamentally unequal power relations, this also implies that those on top do not have to make the same sacrifices as those on the bottom. In fact, it is precisely because others make the costly sacrifices that those in privileged positions can enjoy their heroic victory. And it is for this reason that those who benefit from hero systems the most also benefit from deliberately obscuring this inequality. We see this in military boot camps, for example.
From now on, you will speak only when spoken to.
Do you understand?
Sir, yes, sir!
At face value, boot camps are rites of passage that build character, form brotherhoods, and train new recruits for the hardship and challenges of war. They can be seen as either a lesser evil that is necessary to prepare recruits for the greater evil of actual war, or even as a challenge to aspire to.
I was hooked.
Hit.
But looking at it more critically, boot camps provide measurements for heroism that recruits can meet, exceed, or fall short of. It turns their entry into the hero system into a competition, and tells them only the worthy deserve to succeed.
That is a quitter. You say goodbye, I say good riddance.
In doing so, the perceived obstacle becomes not the unequal structure of that competition, nor the fact that it marginalizes entire groups of people through racism, homophobia, and general bigotry.
You must have Cherokee or Shawnee blood in you.
No, sir.
Are you contradicting me? You wagon-burning son of a bitch! No, Sergeant!
The perceived obstacle becomes the weak and unworthy that are holding them back, that need to be separated from the strong and deserving, which explains why we so often see recruits becoming hostile to those of their own, those who are perceived to be in their way of heroic victory. It also explains why for many people the boot camp sequence in Full Metal Jacket did not achieve its intended effect, because while it does show how this ritual can end in a tragedy, it shows the tragedy as driven by the weaker link of the group, which raises the question, does this really question the nature of the boot camp and its place within an unequal hero system, or does it merely suggest that this particular individual was not cut out for it, which in turn would only affirm its primary function and even its necessity, rather than critique it?
I was a good soldier. I had purpose, and I loved it.
Another way a hero system's inequality is obscured is by downplaying the traumatic experiences of soldiers. Within highly militaristic hero systems, trauma is a token of the shadow, a weakness that suggests that the hero system is not successful in achieving its heroic victory, and could therefore bring the whole thing into question. Hence, it is rather avoided.
You are my hammer out there. Don't let these young guys see you fold like this. It's bad for morale. Bad for big army.
The film Thank You for Your Service sheds some light on how the suppression of trauma can have devastating consequences for veterans, in particular when this suppression extends to institutions and services that are supposed to take care of them.
It could be 6 to 9 months.
You think these guys can wait that long?
But what is perhaps the most effective shield to deflect criticisms on the nature of hero systems, and the final and most resilient barrier towards making a true anti-war film, is heroism itself.
We like things nice and simple. Good and evil. Heroes and villains.
So far we have discussed how anti-war films can critique hero systems through the purposeful use of violence, examinations of other hero systems, and by exposing how the promise of heroic victory is abused by people in power to let others make the great sacrifices, only to cast them aside afterwards. But to truly deconstruct a hero system is to face what Monet argued is the greatest taboo of militarism. That is, the possibility that military deaths are in fact for nothing, that there is no such thing as a hero. And yet it is a taboo we're going to have to break, because it is also one that reveals a lot about the way in which heroes, and particularly stories of heroes, are used to keep hero systems in place and to undermine true anti-war films.
Seeing him in that photograph, I don't know why it makes me feel better, but it does.
In the film Flags of Our Fathers, a mother is led to believe that her fallen son was in the now famous photograph of the planting of the American flag on Iwo Jima, even though it is revealed to us that he wasn't. And we are shown how those in control of such stories know how cruel it would be to take that away from a grieving mother, to tell her that her son's death didn't have the significance she thought it had, and therefore how it is much easier to just go along with the story and not question the more complicated and much more political reality behind it.
Well, to be honest, ma'am, it happened so quick and, yeah, I think that's where he was. That's Hank.
Thank you.
And the thing is, they are right. It is cruel, inhumane even, to rob grieving families of their last bit of consolation. But the problem is that the sacrifices made by these soldiers are also easily weaponized in a way that prevents us from questioning why those sacrifices had to be made in the first place. This can be done deliberately, but it is also something that often happens inadvertently out of compassion and decency towards the human lives that were lost. Because it is true that to attack a hero system is to attack the significance it gives to death, and therefore to attack a hero system is to attack the significance of the deaths of real people, which in turn can easily be experienced as inconsiderate or disrespectful. I think it is because of this reason that so many films ultimately fail to truly deliver on their anti-war statement, and end up with what is at best a hate the war but love the warrior kind of story. A story that acknowledges the destructiveness of war, and even the problematic nature of the hero systems that led to them, but also sidesteps any real commentary on it, which again is perfectly understandable and certainly an issue that can be born out of the best of intentions.
The real heroes are dead on that island.
Stories like these often focus on the individual soldiers, their bravery and sacrifices, their loyalty and brotherhood.
But for my dad and these men, the risks they took, the wounds they suffered, they did that for their buddies.
They won't understand.
Goody, I got you.
It's about the men next to you. And that's it.
But by highlighting these personal virtues and meaningful qualities, they can't help but at least partially redeem what they also want to critique. This also becomes clear when we look at how these stories are experienced by us. For the immediate emotional impact of heroic war stories is undeniable. They move us, they make us feel grateful, they leave us in tears over the great sacrifices that were made. especially when it comes to true stories, and most of them are. But we have to ask, what purpose do they really serve? What does it mean for us to sit in the comfort of our homes and consume stories of tragic war heroes? This is where we have to move away from the successes and shortcomings of war films and towards the role that we play as their audience. Because if filmmakers are complicit in failing at anti-war, then so are we. In the film 1917, we follow Lance Corporal Schofield, who is tasked with delivering a vital message that will prevent 1,600 men from walking into a deadly trap. And there's this moment towards the end where, after having gone through hell, Schofield finally reaches the battalion and collapses down between them. And I thought, this could have been a really powerful ending. To have Schofield die between these joyful young men who are completely oblivious to what they're about to walk into. Or better yet, he delivers the message but it is discarded by the overzealous commander, as also almost seems to happen, and Schofield is left powerless as the men storm off towards their fateful end. I can only imagine what a statement that could have been on the needless waste of human life in war. Of course, this is not what happens. Instead, Schofield gets the great hero shot and succeeds at his mission, thereby saving not all but still many lives. Now, it was still a rather bittersweet ending, but overall I felt relieved at the end, and I found myself rewatching that one heroic scene because it was just so powerful. But then I started wondering what this really implies, and this brought me to another film.
I paint the tombs of the prophets. They look up and they imagine that if they lived back in Christ's time, they wouldn't have done what the others did.
There's an interesting scene in A Hidden Life in which the main character meets a painter who questions the purpose of his religious imagery. While the film is about an Austrian man resisting the Nazi regime, an act for which he is eventually prosecuted and killed. This particular sequence touches on a more fundamental issue about how we relate ourselves to hero systems, and especially heroic stories within those hero systems.
What we do is just create sympathy. We create admirers. We don't create followers.
As we've seen in the opening discussion, the potential for anti-war partly depends on the eye of the beholder, and it is here that Becker makes what is probably the most confronting observation, as he argues that this beholder is by default a fundamentally selfish one. According to him, the price we pay for being naturally narcissistic animals is that very few of us, if pressured, would be unwilling to sacrifice someone else in our place. This is why we worship heroes so much, as they are the exception to this rule. They make the sacrifices so few are willing to make. But what we are reluctant to admit, Becker continues, is that the admiration of the hero is a vicarious catharsis of our own fears, fears that are deeply hidden, and this is what plunges us into uncritical hero worship. What the hero does seems so superlative to us. In other words, the danger of worshipping heroes is that we end up admiring them not as a means to an end, that is, as an inspiration for meaningful transformation, but instead as an end in itself. Like the phenomenon of scapegoating, we can project our desire for heroic victory onto others, and through their heroism, enjoy it as if it were our own. I say this was a confronting observation because it certainly was so for me. I love war films, and I love to think I'm a better person for watching them, for soaking in the suffering of others and believing it guides me towards better values. But there is a confession to be made here. I have never helped out families of fallen soldiers. I don't donate to organizations supporting veterans who are struggling at home. I'm not marching down the streets in defiance of war. I'm not actively protesting military recruitment programs that are preying on the young who are still impressionable and on the marginalized who are led to believe they have no other recourse for a meaningful life. I'm watching these heroic war stories, in part because I am genuinely in awe of seeing the power and perseverance of the human spirit, but also because it feeds into my own narcissism. I love seeing these acts of heroism and, as I'm sure many others do, I imagine that could be me. I like to believe that, if the situation demands it, I too would be capable of making the great sacrifice. I too would emerge as a hero, though the reality is, I probably won't. And yet, I indulge myself in the fantasy, and even find a strange sense of moral accomplishment in doing so. As in, I already feel more heroic just because I can imagine myself being so. The experience is not unlike watching superhero films, but of course the difference is that these are stories about real people, and they really got killed. And so it is important to ask ourselves if we are truly honoring and giving significance to those lives, or if we too are turning them into sacrificial lambs that only serve our own vanity and provide us with personal comfort.
Christ's life is a demand. You don't want to be reminded of it. I paint their comfortable Christ with a halo over his head, so we don't have to see what happens to the truth.
If we are to fully understand the potential for and meaning of anti-war films, we have to acknowledge the possibility that there is a deep down secret part of us that does not want them. Because by truly attacking the hero systems that drive us to war, we are also attacking a part of ourselves. The part that longs for our own heroic victory over death, for our own achievement of greater significance. And so it is understandable that instead of truly striving for anti-war, for the absolute deconstruction of hero systems, it is extremely tempting to instead cling to our reassuring tale of the hero, to our comfortable Christ.
Someday I might have the courage to venture, not yet. Someday I'll paint the true Christ.
In the conclusion to his book, Becker poses what is probably the most burning question after all this, that being, what is possible? We have discussed our instinctive urge to transcend death through symbolic significance, how hero systems have emerged to achieve this, and how they have destructive consequences by projecting our fears and weaknesses onto others. For Becker, this is not a condition to be overcome, but a necessity to be able to stand life. The fact is that men cannot and do not stand on their own powers, he writes. Moral dependence is a natural motive of the human condition and has to be absolved from something beyond oneself. What this implies is that we need heroes, villains, meaningful action. We need stories. We need that which grants us significance. In Becker's words, this makes us an impossible animal, one who, individually, needs for healthy action the very conduct that, on a general level, is destructive to him. This also is the great struggle of the anti-war film. There is a part of us that simply cannot face the reality of its implications. We cannot truly face the meaningless waste of human life. We cannot truly accept the possibility that all the harrowing pain and sorrow accumulated over centuries of war carried no greater significance. We need to believe it was all worth something. But this is also why anti-war films, or at least the effort towards them, is so important. If you talk about heroics that cost mountains of human life, Becker continues, You have to find out why such heroics are practiced in a given social system, who is scapegoating whom, what social classes are excluded from heroism, what there is in the social structure that drives the society blindly to self-destructive heroics. The real problem, however, is finding some kind of non-destructive alternative, and then translate that into transformative cinema. Monet argued that war films can only be as anti-war as their viewers already are. And while I think it is true that anti-war statements generally don't reach those who need them the most, that being those who are most deeply immersed in their hero system, I don't fully share in her pessimism. Sigmund Freud believed that human beings were violent out of lust, and if he was right, then warfare is a fatality for all time. But if we are violent out of animal fears, as Becker now argues, then there is a small possibility that those fears can be examined and calmed. Becker imagines an ideal world that achieves this by putting the problem of death central, a world that admits to its own fear of extinction and insignificance, and questions its own hero systems, a world in which leaders always act fully aware of the implications of their own deeply hidden fears, and always consider the full weight of every single human life and its suffering. Such a world, unfortunately, is little more than an utopian fantasy, although Becker does mention one social system that comes somewhat close to it, and that is democracy. With its free flow of criticism, art and science, democracy acts in constant defiance of its own cultural fictions, which is why authoritarians despise it so much. It seems ridiculously intent on discrediting itself, as Becker put it. When it comes to cinema, democracy at least provides the possibility for war films that urge us to really face the mirror, to look critically at ourselves instead of clinging to stories that merely give us comfort. And by continuing to push us into self-reflection, by helping us understand our human condition in creative and insightful ways, maybe then, someday, we might just find that tiny measure of reason to balance destruction.